Hello and welcome back. In the previous lesson, we looked at two types of sentences, a simple sentence and a compound sentence. And in this lecture, we will learn about complex sentences and three different kinds of dependent clauses. Now, so far, we've learned about a simple sentence which contains one independent clause, and we also learned about a compound sentence which contains two or more independent clauses. And a complex sentence is a sentence that contains one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. Now, an independent clause is a standalone clause. We can put a period at the end and create a simple sentence. It's a complete thought. However, a dependent clause cannot be made into a simple sentence by adding a period at the end. For a dependent clause to become a part of a sentence, it needs an independent clause, which then results in forming a complex sentence. Now, there are three kinds of dependent clauses: an adverbial clause, a relative clause, and a noun clause. So let's go through each of these dependent clauses. Now, an adverb can modify adjectives, but it mainly modifies a verb. And similarly, an adverbial clause's main function is to modify the verb in the independent clause. So an adverbial clause can help to say when, how, or why the action in the independent clause happens. Let's take a look at a complex sentence that connects an independent clause and an adverbial clause. When my father was young, he used to play a lot of tennis. In this sentence, the independent clause is he used to play a lot of tennis, and the adverbial clause is when my father was young. And generally, an adverbial clause is made up of a clause and a subordinating conjunction. So the clause is my father was young, and the subordinating conjunction is when. And like coordinating conjunctions, subordinating conjunctions help to build relationships between the two clauses. In this sentence, the subordinating conjunction when helps to show a time-order relationship between the independent and dependent clauses. When my father was young helps to modify the verb phrase used to play. It tells us when my father used to play a lot of tennis. Now, one major difference between subordinating conjunctions and coordinating conjunctions is that subordinating conjunctions can be positioned at the beginning of the sentence, like this, as well as in the middle of the sentence. So the same sentence can be written as, my father used to play a lot of tennis when he was young. And a key difference between these sentences is that when the subordinating conjunction is in the middle of the sentence, you do not need to write a comma between the two clauses. Now, unlike coordinating conjunctions, there are many more subordinating conjunctions. And these subordinating conjunctions help to form many different kinds of relationships. Some help to form time-order relationships. Some help to form cause and effect relationships. Some help to form contrast relationships, and so on. And like coordinating conjunctions, learning how these subordinating conjunctions is really important for the TOEFL test. So do make sure to do the quiz right after this lecture, and also use the worksheets to strengthen your understanding of adverbial clauses and how they function. Okay, so let's now move on and take a look at the relative clause. Now, if adverbial clauses help to modify the verb in the independent clause, relative clauses' main role is to describe or to provide more information about a particular noun. Therefore, relative clauses function like adjectives. Let's take a look at a complex sentence that uses a relative clause. The book that I love the most is Kite Runner. Now, a relative clause begins with a relative pronoun, usually that, who, or which. And within the relative clause, there may be a subject, and there is always a verb. The relative clause in this sentence is that I love the most, and it provides more information about the noun, the book. Now, relative clauses can be divided into two types, a defining relative clause and a non-defining relative clause. A defining relative clause is a relative clause that helps to define a noun. It provides essential information about a noun, so a sentence would be incomplete without that relative clause. On the other hand, a non-defining relative clause is a relative clause that provides extra information. So the sentence would still be complete without that relative clause. And in this sentence, this relative clause helps to define the noun, the book. Without this relative clause, this sentence would be incomplete. If we just read the book is Kite Runner, then we'll be wondering what the book is referring to. Therefore, this relative clause helps to define what the book is. Here's an example sentence that uses a non-defining relative clause. John sold his old car, which he had bought from his sister. Now, in this sentence, the relative clause which he had bought from his sister provides extra information about the noun, his old car. Even without this information, the sentence is complete. John sold his old car. There is nothing confusing about this sentence. Now, in terms of structure, a key difference between defining and non-defining relative clause is that non-defining relative clauses are separated from the independent clause using commas. Now, developing good understanding of relative clauses will help you with both reading and listening comprehension. And in your speaking and writing responses, you need to show that you are capable of using different kinds of sentence structures. So to strengthen your understanding of relative clauses, do make sure to do the quiz that follows this lecture and also make use of the worksheet. Okay, so let's now move on to the third dependent clause, a noun clause. A noun clause acts as a noun in a sentence, so it can function as the sentence subject, object of the verb, or the object of a preposition. A noun clause begins with words like what, who, that, if, where, and so on. And there is usually a subject and a verb. Here are three complex sentences that use noun clauses. What you said upset the others. I know what you did. I thought about what you told me. In the first sentence, what you said is a noun clause, and it functions as the sentence subject. In the second sentence, what you did is a noun clause, and it functions as the object of the verb. And in the last sentence, what you told me is a noun clause, and it functions as the object of the preposition. So although in essence the noun clauses are part of the independent clause, they are dependent clauses. So these short sentences are also considered as complex sentences. Okay, so that's the overview of three different types of dependent clauses, which can join an independent clause to form a complex sentence. However, it's important to keep in mind that a complex sentence can have more than one dependent clause. So in TOEFL passages, you will often see sentences like this. Many linguists who reject the theory argue that there is an abundance of evidence that supports their view. Now, if you look at this sentence, first we have a relative clause who reject the theory. So that's one dependent clause. Then we have a noun clause that functions as the object of the verb argue. And lastly, we have another relative clause giving more information about the noun evidence. And there is, of course, an independent clause, many linguists argue. So this complex sentence has one independent clause and three dependent clauses. And sentences like this, where you have one independent clause and two or three dependent clauses, is very common. However, while you don't need to analyze every sentence in this way, whenever you have trouble with understanding a sentence, being able to identify different clauses can actually help with comprehension, as it's always much easier to understand a sentence when you're focusing on smaller portion of language. Also, for certain questions, particularly for the sentence simplification question in the reading passage, your ability to break up a sentence like this will be crucial in answering that question. We will of course show you this in more detail as we go through the reading questions later. Okay, so that's it for this lecture on learning about dependent clauses. And following this lecture, there are quizzes and worksheets for all three different types of dependent clauses, as well as complex sentences. So do make sure to do all the quizzes and use the worksheets to strengthen your understanding of what we learn in this lecture. That's it for this lecture on complex sentences and dependent clauses.